Hey everyone, my name is Alex Pond with the UNM Division of Community Behavioral Health. Welcome to today's webinar presentation for the Rural and Community Psychiatric Residency Program webinar series. Just a few announcements before we get started. Please make sure your sound is muted during the presentation. If you have any questions, please submit them in the chat or feel free to unmute if Dr. Tiger opens up the floor. For those requesting a CE or certificate of completion, I'll share an evaluation link in the chat towards the end of the presentation. In order to receive a certificate, you must attend the full presentation. Also, please note that the link is only available for 48 hours after the presentation. I'll now hand it over to Dr. Shed, and please let me know if you have any questions. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Megan. I'm one of the rural chiefs here at the UNM Department of Psychiatry. I want to introduce Dr. Tiger, who will be doing this talk today. He is a graduate from the University of Oklahoma College of Medicine and currently a resident psychiatrist here at UNM Department of Psychiatry. He has clinical experience in various inpatient and outpatient psychiatric settings, including at the UNM Hospital, at the Veterans Affairs Medical Center, and at the Zuni Comprehensive Health Center in the Indian Health Service. He's going to be discussing sleep science and mental well-being, a very important topic. So I'll go ahead and turn it over to him.
Hi, everybody. Can you guys hear me okay?
Sounds good.
Awesome. So yeah, thanks for being here today. A relatively small group, but that might allow for some more questions and discussion toward the end. So yeah, today I'm going to talk about the science of sleep and how it applies to mental well-being and ways that we can encourage our patients to incorporate habits, things that are under their control that will allow them to get better sleep. And also I would encourage you to take this knowledge and try to use it for ourselves, because our mental well-being is important also. There's a reason that when you fly, they want you to put your oxygen mask on first before helping others. So without further ado, I will start the presentation. Again, so these are sort of my experiences that Dr. Shed already highlighted. Here's your CE slide. So full disclosure, I do not have a financial arrangement related to the content of this activity, and the views expressed in my presentation are mine and do not necessarily represent the views, policies, and positions of UNM. So a couple of learning objectives. So first of all, by the end of this presentation, you should be able to describe the importance of sleep as it applies to mental well-being, identify barriers to optimal sleep and strategies to overcome them. And then as I was going through the slideshow yesterday afternoon, I realized number 3 and 4 are sort of like, we can combine those two. So probably didn't need to list them as separate ones because they kind of are interrelated, but applying scientific principles of sleep toward the goal of achieving optimal sleep for mental well-being, and then developing strategies to manage and intervene with patients who are struggling with sleep. So why even talk about sleep? So sleep resets our ability to be focused, to be alert, and most importantly for this setting, to be emotionally stable during the wakeful period. Sleep affects wakefulness, it affects motivation, it affects mood, and it affects well-being. Essentially, sleep is tethered to wakefulness. We can't really talk about sleep if we don't also talk about wakefulness, because those two are indelibly tethered to one another. What we consciously do, decisions we make, habits that we have in our waking state determine when we fall asleep, how quickly we fall asleep, whether or not we stay asleep, and how we feel when we wake up the next day. So essentially, a quality of sleep you get really does set the stage for your daily quality of life. Benefits of increased sleep or optimal sleep include increased productivity, efficiency, creativity. And it should come as no surprise that quality sleep results in higher quality of mood. Furthermore, the ability of a person to handle challenges throughout the day improves with a solid foundation, having well-rested mind and body, and is fit to handle the emotional, physical, and mental challenges that could come our way any given day. So just as a disclaimer also, and I've got this cited on my references at the end, this was brought to my attention about 3 or 4 months ago. I heard a lecture on a podcast that I like called the Huberman Lab. There's a neuroscientist. He's a tenured professor in the Department of Neurobiology at Stanford. His name is Andrew Huberman, and he has a podcast that focuses on neuroscience, neurobiology, and several of there's a lecture series over sleep. So a lot of the ideals and thought behind this lecture are coming from that. So I just wanted to throw that out there and let you all know, if you are interested, by the end of this, I would recommend that you go back and attend those lectures for a little more detail, more than I could provide in an hour. So I'm not here to convince any of you that, sleep is a good thing. I think we all know that. We all already recommend that to our patients, anecdotally, just from our life experiences. When you feel well rested, you tend to be able to perform better, tend to be able to emotionally regulate better. Anxiety tends to be improved. So, if put this image up just because it sort of symbolizes, if I were to try to find all the studies that correlated quality sleep and the amount of quality sleep with effect on depression, anxiety, medical things, right? So like metabolic effects, cardiovascular effects, benefits, there would be a ton of data showing that, and we all know that. So I'm not here to convince you that it's good. That there is a positive correlation between, quality sleep and improved outcomes. What I am going to talk about today, though, is how to get better at sleeping. And I want to emphasize a non-pharmacologic approach. There are medicines that we use in our patient populations, especially in acute, crisis situations and in emergency settings or inpatient, where I would say it's definitely appropriate when patients need to sleep immediately, and also an outpatient, it can be warranted. But I do think that as providers, it's important that we recognize that none of the medications that we use are benign, and there are many advantages to alleviating the pharmacologic burden on our patients, so side effect profiles. Also, just like a psychological and physiological dependence on medications isn't the most ideal situation for our patients. So with that in mind, I'm not going to focus on the meds that we use for sleep today. So the majority of the population is aware that it's important to get a good night's rest on a consistent basis. However, not everyone knows exactly how to do it. Most people tend to have difficulty consistently getting 7 to 9 hours of sleep every night, and it's not uncommon for us to, struggle with getting optimal sleep every couple of nights at least. So today we're going to focus on tools that will help you fall asleep, sleep better, and emerge from sleep feeling more rested. And these are tools that obviously we want to pass on to our patients and talk to them about. And it gives them sort of, the idea is hopefully more of an internal locus of control. These are things they can actually control to help, lay this solid foundation for better outcomes during the wakeful state. So how much sleep is optimal? So I took this figure from a study performed by scientists at the University of Western Ontario. It's the largest sleep study that's ever been done. It began in 2017. Participant scores across various domains were gathered along with their respective number of sleep hours and it was found that the optimal number of sleep hours was 7.19. So from the study, we can postulate what we've been told for many years. 7 to 8 hours of sleep tends to yield favorable results regarding cognitive abilities. There are many studies that say similar things, all with similar result. The reason I chose to include this one only is because one, it was the largest sleep study ever to that point, and it's fairly recent. Like I said, started back in 2017. So who gets enough sleep? Just a couple of statistics that I found when I was researching for this lecture. This one's a little older, but it is from Gallup 2013 poll. 40% of people in the US get less than the recommended amount, so less than that 7 to 8 hours. Also, this is from the CDC in 2016, that 1 in 3 adults don't get enough sleep. And then finally, a graphical representation of insufficient sleep by race and ethnicity. As you all know, it's important whenever we're discussing our patient populations to sort of stratify based on race and ethnicity and culture. And as you can see, Black Americans, Hawaiian, Pacific Islanders, American Indians that we see quite often here in this state especially, tend to have most difficulty getting sufficient sleep. And even the ones who are getting the most sleep of the ones who are polled here, still, over 30% of those reported not getting sufficient sleep, so less than 7 hours a night. So this is an issue that, we have control over and are able to remedy. So what governs sleep? So what dictates the timing of the onset of sleep? So in other words, what makes you get tired at a certain time of day? So remember throughout the talk today that all these determinants directly affect the quality of your wakeful state, including your mood and your ability to emotionally regulate. This is why, I chose this topic to discuss in the setting of a behavioral health quorum. Most have heard the term circadian rhythm before. So this is driven primarily by light, and we're going to talk about that in more detail here in a bit. But there's also another force that contributes to sleep regulation or dysregulation, as we'll soon see. The second force is a chemical force, and the chemical is called adenosine. Both of these forces work in conjunction to cumulatively regulate sleep. And first, before we talk about circadian rhythm, which is what the majority of this talk is going to be about, I want to talk about adenosine briefly, just so you're aware. So adenosine is a molecule in our nervous system and body that builds up the longer that we're awake. So following prolonged periods of sleep, the levels of adenosine will be very low in your body. Conversely, following prolonged periods of being awake, the adenosine will be very high. So for the majority of individuals with normal diurnal lifestyles, the level of adenosine is associated with day and night and tends to increase as the day wanes on. Adenosine does create a sleep drive or a hunger for sleep by activating inhibitory receptors in your brain. So whenever you think adenosine, think that it's time to go to sleep, and this builds up throughout the day. Adenosine and its chemical makeup has helped to create a multi-billion-dollar industry. There happens to be another molecule that occurs in nature with a very similar structure to adenosine. This is called caffeine. Some of you may have already guessed. Caffeine is the most consumed psychoactive compound in the world. It is a socially acceptable psychoactive drug, and it's readily available through dietary products such as coffee, tea, soft drinks, chocolate. Also, it can be added to non-prescription medications. Some of you may have seen it in pain relievers or cold remedies. So regardless of the source, worldwide average caffeine consumption has been estimated to be just under 80 milligrams a day. So just for reference, a cup of coffee generally has between 65 and 110, 115 milligrams, depending on where you get it. Unless you get it at Starbucks, it seems like theirs tends to have a little more, just anecdotally. I don't have the data on that. So Why bring up caffeine? Simply because most of us are familiar with caffeine, and it's a good way to help remember the function of adenosine. So caffeine is an adenosine antagonist. This means that it will bind to the same receptor in the brain that adenosine is supposed to bind to. And remember, adenosine is inhibitory, right? Or the adenosine receptor is inhibitory. So whenever the caffeine binds, it disallows adenosine from binding at those inhibitory receptors, which means that the downstream implications of that inhibitory receptor activation can't take place, i.e. you will not feel sleepy. Both molecules do contain, as you can see, primary adenine groups. The only difference is the adenosine has the little ribose group here, but given the similar structure, this is how they can both bind at the same site. So this is why caffeine either helps you wake up in the morning or wards off afternoon sleepiness. It's essentially blocking that sleepy receptor. It's also why people often feel a crash once the caffeine starts to wear off, because now those adenosine molecules that are still there can bind to those receptors, sometimes with a higher affinity, and it can lead to a strong feeling or urge to sleep. So just as an aside, I don't want to like demonize caffeine. I habitually use it daily, and I enjoy a morning cup of coffee. I just briefly would caution against using it late in the day. So studies have shown the half-life of caffeine to be between 1.5 to 9.5 hours, and depending on several environmental factors, including your genetic makeup, some individuals will have difficulty activating these inhibitory receptors that are necessary for quality sleep if you consume caffeine too late in the day. Having said all this, though, caffeine does also have health benefits that have been associated with it, including improved memory, reaction times, overall improved mental health, as well as anti-inflammatory, cardiovascular, and metabolic benefits. So it's best for each individual to self-experiment if you're going to use caffeine in order to find the right amount and timing that allows for healthy intake without compromising healthy sleep. So that's it for talking about caffeine. It's difficult to talk about sleep and sleep hygiene without mentioning this molecule because it is so intertwined with the chemical force that drives our sleep behavior. Remember, that is the adenosine molecule. So why, after like pulling an all-nighter, if any of you have ever done that for like studying for tests, or if you had a shift where you had to work all night, we do that in the hospital sometimes, you do tend to, and if you stay up all night, get a little bit of a second wind, early in the morning, like 5, 6 a.m. Kind of an increase in energy and alertness, despite knowing that you have adenosine built up all through the night, which is a good segue into the second force that governs our sleep-wake cycle. And we've already kind of talked about it a little bit. This is the most prominent force, and this is your circadian force. So the term circadian is derived from two Latin terms, circa, which means about, and dies, which means day, so about a day. And again, most of you have heard of this term circadian rhythm. Per the National Institute of General Medical Sciences, circadian rhythms are physical, mental, and behavioral changes that follow a 24-hour cycle. These natural processes respond primarily to light and dark, and affect most living things. So your circadian force is controlled by a natural clock that's located in your brain, like just above the roof of your mouth. It determines when we feel the need to sleep and when we feel the need to be awake. So these respective periods tend to be condensed into two distinct blocks. Sleep blocks tend to range between 6 to 10 hours, and they can vary by individual, and they're dependent on a number of variables, including age and genetic makeup. So each block of sleep is governed by a number of things, including light and dark, which is the most influential and what we'll spend most of our time talking about today. But also hormone release is important, and body temperature. There are a few other things that I'll hit on briefly at the end if I have time. Exercise, eating, those kind of things can also control your circadian rhythm or help to influence phase delays and things like that in your circadian rhythm. So what goes on internally when we wake up? So let's talk about hormones. So most people, when you wake up, tend to wake up sometime around when the sun rises. Again, this obviously excludes shift workers, but for the purpose of this discussion, I'm going to focus again on the majority of individuals with diurnal habits. So at the time of waking, within 1 to 2 hours of sunrise, the levels of adenosine are also low, as we discussed. And additionally, your system generates an internal signal in the form of a hormone. And just as a reminder, hormones are chemical molecules that are released by some organ in your body, then they travel to other organs in your body, including your nervous system, where they exert their effect. So when we wake up in the morning, our adrenal glands, which sit atop your kidney, release two important hormones in a pulsatile fashion, which just means it's a short burst. This first one is called cortisol, and this one here is called epinephrine. Epinephrine is also known as adrenaline. In addition to this release of these hormones from your adrenal gland, you also have epinephrine released from your brain as well. So the cumulative pulsatile release of these hormones, they may come from the sound of the alarm clock, or it may come from just like natural waking up. Regardless, when these hormones bind to their receptors on various other organs in your body, they serve as a signal that it's time to start activating. Effects in our body include increased heart rate, tensing of muscles, essentially telling your body that it's time to start moving around. So as mentioned, these receptors do have receptors on, or these hormones have receptors on nearly every organ system in the body. And it's important that this pulse of cortisol occur at the beginning of your wakeful time of day. So cortisol is also known as a stress hormone. I'm sure many of you have heard it called that before. And it can be increased during times of emotional or physiologic stress. A normal amount of cortisol release when appropriate, however, is good. It's healthy, and so it makes you want to get up, stay alert, move, go on about your daily tasks, go to work, go to school, participate in social activities, exercise, those kind of things. So just around the time that you're waking up and your cortisol release occurs, another neurological timer is set within your nervous system that dictates when a different hormone called melatonin will eventually be released later in the evening. So this is essentially a communication between these two cellular timers in your nervous system, alerting you that in roughly 12 to 14 hours, melatonin is going to be released from the pineal gland. Most of you are familiar with melatonin. It's a sleep hormone, usually released in the evening between the hours of 8 and 10 o'clock, and tends to make us tired. You buy melatonin over the counter, many people do, to help them fall asleep in the evenings. So again, in essence, we're talking about two hormonal signals. The wakefulness signal, cortisol, which acts on all the organs in your body, telling them to wake up, it's time to go. It also kickstarts the clock for the pineal gland to release melatonin 12 to 14 hours later. So let's talk a little bit about melatonin. So that the rhythmic release of cortisol and by cortisol melatonin, it's an endogenous process, which means that it's happening in us all the time without any external input. In fact, if you were living inside of a cave and you were in complete darkness, there was no light, or if you were in a situation where the environment was like light 24 hours a day, right? This rhythmic release of cortisol and by cortisol melatonin, it would still continue. Cortisol would be released, as you can see on the graph here. It would sort of peak around 6, 7 o'clock, and it would trend upward, and then it would come back down. Melatonin would then be released 12 to 14 hours later. And this would happen again absent any stimulus. Now, these endogenous mechanisms are set up though so that external stimuli can govern when they happen. And there's one particular sensory event that has the most bearing on when the cortisol will begin to rise. And that event is light. So under normal circumstances, so when you wake up, you open your eyes, and what happens when you open your eyes? Light comes in. So there are a particular set of neuronal cell in the back of your eye on your retina. These are called retinal ganglion cells. These are considered brain cells. So the retina is a portion of our brain that resides outside of the skull. And when light photons enter the eye, there's a particular type of light that activates a particular type of ganglion cell. These are called melanopsin ganglion cells, in case you're curious. And this is about to get sort of, I guess, like neurobiological, like heavy. But if there are any questions toward the end, I can try to answer to the best of my ability. So I apologize in advance if I do lose you. If I do, feel free. Maybe just type questions in a chat and we'll get to them at the end. But essentially what happens is the light photons enter your eye. They hit these ganglion cells, and the ganglion cells then send a message to this area that I was talking about that's here above your tongue. In this image here on the right, I'm sorry, above the roof of your mouth, it's called the suprachiasmatic nucleus. And this is your biological clock, essentially. So the suprachiasmatic nucleus has connections that allow it to essentially communicate with nearly every other cell in your body via central nervous system to peripheral nervous system communication. So it's critical that the timing of this communication of light to our central clock is appropriate. There have been many studies that have shown the deleterious effects of improper sleep patterns across, like I talked about, multiple domains: cardiovascular health, metabolic effects, neurocognitive deficits, and again, of particular importance to this audience, mental well-being. So these particular activating neurons, the ganglion cells, they respond best to a particular quality of light and an amount of that light. And the light I'm talking about is sunlight. So even more specific, it's sunlight that comes from what's called a low solar angle. So this type of sunlight is only available at certain times of the day when the sun is low in the sky. So usually within 1 to 2 hours after sunrise, and again 1 to 2 hours prior to sunset. So artificial light from like screens and bulbs, they do have light energy. And they can activate these ganglion cells, however, not nearly as effectively as natural sunlight without a filter will. So natural sunlight is preferred to sort of kickstart this circadian rhythm and this release of cortisol. So there's a scientist at another one, he practices at Stanford in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences. His name is Jamie Zeitzer. And he's an expert in this field, has done many studies in this field, and was found in one of his studies that I referenced at the end, that's 50% less effective to view sunlight through windows, such as like your car windshield or the side window of a car, than it is to simply be outside without sunglasses and just allowing light photons to penetrate your eyes early in the day. So it's important to remember, again, that this particular type of light is only available within the first 1 to 2 hours following sunrise. So if it's like 10:30 or 11 and you just woke up and you're rushing to McDonald's to get breakfast, then you may have missed that window of this particular type of low angle photon energy, which means we may have missed our chance to time that cortisol pulse, which obviously is not ideal, because it could cause phase delays, and if done consistently, could really inhibit that appropriate release that can affect melatonin release later in the day, and make it a little more difficult to fall asleep at night. So really quick, of particular interest to the group that I'm talking to right now is that there's been an association between increased cortisol levels later in the day and increased incidences in depression and anxiety. So obviously we can't infer causation, but we can definitely see the correlation. So it's like the chicken and the egg conversation. Regardless, though, shifting the cortisol release earlier in the day does have positive effects on mood regulation, anxiety, in addition to the medical benefits that we talked about earlier. So how much time spent receiving these photons is enough to set the clock? It actually depends on the environment. So if you were like, on spring break in Colorado, skiing, and there's no cloud in the sky, obviously the light's a little more intense. So you wouldn't need to be exposed to it for quite as long. So the more intense the light, the less time is required. But think conversely, if you're maybe in northern Canada in the middle of winter and there's not a whole lot of access to bright sun, you may need to be exposed to the sunlight a little longer. The science has found that you want anywhere between 10,000 to 50,000 lux. Lux is a SI unit of light energy. And to set this clock, for most people, tends to be anywhere between 2 to 10 minutes, should do the trick. For me, it's kind of easy to incorporate into a morning routine. If you take a little brief walk in your neighborhood in the morning as the sun's coming up, just with eyes exposed to, again, you have photons kind of scattering throughout the atmosphere, so you don't need to like look at the sun. In fact, it's not recommended. You don't, like, if it hurts your eye to look at the light, then you don't want to be doing that. But you all know it's like a softer light in the morning. Even if you're walking away from the sun, you're still getting those photons hitting the retina, which is what you want. Again, for 10 to 15 minutes in the morning, within 1 to 2 hours of sunrise. So again, artificial light from the phone or screen isn't going to be adequate or as efficient as the sunlight. And the reason is because your photoreceptors are a little less sensitive early in the day after just waking up, and that's why you need the photon energy from a light. So if you can, try to avoid, using cell phones or screens to get to this effect. So this should be done consistently because these systems operate by averaging when you view the brightest light. So don't think like, oh no, I slept in this morning, I missed my chance and now I'm not going to go to sleep tonight. That's not what's going to happen. It's more of an average over like, cumulative weeks, months of you doing these things more consistently than not, that's going to contribute to setting that clock. So I've talked about the chemical force, which is the adenosine. We've talked about the circadian force, including the hormone release, and how sunlight is the most important influencer of that circadian force. There are a few other variables that also have an effect on your circadian force, including food intake, so like timing of when you're eating and what you're eating, and exercise. So I'm going to discuss those here in just a second. But the reason that I'm spending so much time speaking about sunlight is because these melanopsin ganglion cells are the primary input responsible for setting this biological clock, and they're the only direct input to the suprachiasmatic nucleus. So that's why they're so important, and it's so important to get this type of sunlight exposure, early in the morning. So what about sunset? So by viewing sunlight in the evening as the sun is setting, and again, it's at a low solar angle, these melanopsin ganglion cells can signal to that suprachiasmatic nucleus that it's the end of the day, which can prevent some of the deleterious effects of light onto these receptors for the rest of that night. So and I'm going to talk about light exposure in the evening here in just a second. But yeah, it's been shown that by exposing your light to the low angle sunlight at the end of the day sort of sends a signal letting your body kind of know, okay, it's the end of the day, it's time to start relaxing, sleep is coming, and also serves to be a bit protective against again the negative effects of looking at screens later in the evening. So again, you don't want to use sunglasses if you can keep from it. Don't use windows. Like, don't look, like looking out of your car window isn't as effective as the actual photons. And I know I'm repeating myself, but it's easy to kind of be like, and I've done it too. Like, I'm driving to work, that'll be my sunlight, but it's just not quite as beneficial. Okay, so let's talk about bad light really quick before I move on to body temperature. So artificial light is a new phenomena relative to the evolution of our circadian system. Nowadays, we have access to artificial light at times of the day and night that we did not have for millions of years. So earlier I mentioned that your photoreceptors are less sensitive when you first wake up, which is why the photon energy that's given off by artificial light in the morning is not as beneficial as the photon energy given off by sunlight. So the opposite is true at night, when these melanopsin ganglion cells are more sensitive to light. So regardless whether the light is artificial sunlight, the goal, whether it's artificial light or sunlight, the goal should be to allow as little light as possible to enter your eye, as you get closer to bedtime. So, think like after 8, 9 o'clock at night. The goal should be to start obviously decreasing the amount of light that comes into your eye at those times. Because remember, melatonin is the sleep hormone, right? So we're trying to release it now. And if you remember the slide that I showed you at the beginning, when the light comes in, it stops, it tells that suprachiasmatic nucleus and the pineal gland to stop releasing melatonin. So you don't want light later in the day. So furthermore, between the hours of 11 and 4, it's been shown in a study. This is a pretty good study in a journal called Cell, which is a fairly well-known journal, peer-reviewed journal, in 2018, that showed that light entering your eyes between 11 p.m. and 4 a.m. Suppresses the release of dopamine. And it can inhibit learning, and it can also create other detrimental effects on mood. And so just to remind everybody, dopamine is sort of like our feel-good neurotransmitter. You can think of it as like kind of an endogenous antidepressant involved in our reward pathway. And again, the study showed that viewing light between 11 and 4, 11 at night and 4 in the morning, lowered levels of dopamine, which obviously would have deleterious effects on mood. So if you can't, fully cut out like artificial light, at least after 8, 9 o'clock, just definitely make sure you're limiting your exposure as much as possible after 11. So, avoiding the artificial light exposure at night is kind of low-hanging fruit and something that most of us could achieve. Most of our patients, especially our higher functioning patients and the ones we're seeing in outpatient, tend to be able to achieve this with just a little bit of discipline and patience. So this is just, again, a change in habit, and it gives the patient some control over this aspect of their care. Which I try to, in every patient that I see, and I'm sure you all do too, try to give them as much control as possible to empower them to kind of take hold of their own mental health. So just going back a step, talking about these melanopsin ganglion cells, they're concentrated on, and I thought this was really cool when I learned this. So they're concentrated on the lower half of your retina, which makes sense because they're designed to detect sunlight from above, because it wakes you up, right? So the sun rises above your head, so it makes sense that the cells will be on the bottom of your retina. So if you do have lights on in the evening in your house, I mean, depending on how drastic you want to get with this, or how you want to change your habits, it would be ideal to have your lights at or below eye level to prevent the inhibition of the pineal gland toward the end of the day. Obviously, light's going to come in and it's going to hit them to some degree, but lights like over your head, fluorescent lights are probably the worst, versus like having lights at eye level or like, you know, around the floor, like night lights and stuff like that aren't quite as bad. Also, there were some studies that were done that showed candlelight and firelight actually don't activate these cells. So, you know, you can use those throughout the night. As I mentioned, you know, there are other factors that are at play in influencing circadian rhythm. And so before I finish, I think we're doing okay on time. I'm gonna just spend a little time talking about those influencers on circadian rhythm. I want to talk about body temperature. And also I'm going to talk about exercise and eating, which sort of goes in line with temperature and can affect body temperature. And these have a lesser degree of influence than body temperature, which has a lesser degree of influence than sunlight, but they are still important elements. And most importantly to this lecture and for our patients is they are things that, you know, an individual can control. And they have a biologic basis for influencing, you know, how your circadian clock runs. So if we can learn these techniques and pass them on to our patients, you know, I think that should be beneficial for them. So our bodies are programmed to experience a slight dip in core temperature in the evening. Core temperature usually hovers around 98.6 Fahrenheit, 37-ish degrees Celsius, but it does fluctuate by about 2 degrees Fahrenheit throughout the night. The drop in temperature starts about 2 hours before you go to sleep. It coincides with the release of melatonin. During sleep, your body temperature continues to fall. It does reach a low point in the early morning, and then it gradually warms up as the morning progresses. As you can see highlighted in the image here on the slide. So in general, the internal temperature tends to bottom out around 4 a.m. And then it starts to peak, you know, sometime, you know, between 4 and 8. Obviously, this is going to vary between individuals, but this is just a general trend. So, you know, again, similar to the cortisol release, even in the absence of light cues or meal cues, this oscillation in body temperature will occur. However, and also similar to the cortisol release, the timing of the trough and peak is set up such that it can be entrained by external cues. This just means, again, we do have some bit of control over like shifting these phases. And it's always almost always, like, again, we talked about, you know, we can use light as an external cue, but exercise and eating can also play a role, although it is a little bit smaller of a role, but still something we can do. So internal temperature, as you may already know, also has a very strong effect on metabolism and when you'll feel most willing and interested in exercising. And I just wanted to throw this into just for those of you who may be interested. So your desire to exercise will nearly always correlate with steep rises in temperature, which normally occur, you know, 30 minutes after waking up, as you can see in the graph here. 3 hours after waking, and then once again 11 hours after waking up. So whenever I read this, it just kind of clicked and made sense, because if you think about times in your life when you've been, you know, going to the gym or exercising or even going on hikes, things like that, you see people running around jogging, it tends to be either in the morning or, you know, after work. And it does correlate with these spikes in the slope of body temperature. So just as an example, like let's say if you woke up around 7:30, 8 o'clock, so we said 30 minutes after, and as you can see, there's a pretty drastic increase in slope here. Again, a little later, like mid-morning-ish, and then finally, you know, around 6, 7 o'clock, or actually it's closer to 8 o'clock. Yeah. So like around 7, 8 o'clock, tend to see another spike there. And again, sort of anecdotally and thinking back in my life, these are times whenever, you know, gyms or workout areas tend to be a little more busy in the mornings and in the evenings after work. And as you all know, exercise does increase body temperature. So having the knowledge of our bodies wanting to cool down and needing to cool down in the evening to get optimal sleep, it would make sense that if you exercise like late at night before, within an hour or two of going to bed, may be a little more difficult and take a little more time for your body temperature to get back down and to regulate to that lower temperature it needs to get to. Conversely, you could use exercise to help wake you up in the morning, right? So if your body temperature increases due to the exercise in the morning, again, another signal to that circadian rhythm, that circadian force that can help you be a little more alert, in addition to your caffeine jolt that most of us have in the morning as well. So let's talk about food briefly, and I think this is the last thing I want to talk about. I have a figure here showing some amino acid pathways. Ignore the glutamine pathway. I'm only going to talk about the tryptophan and tyrosine. So amino acids are precursors to proteins. And every amino acid goes through a series on its own in the body of metabolic reactions to essentially transform from one compound to another compound. And the amino acid tryptophan, as you can see here, eventually will become serotonin, which will eventually become melatonin. The amino acid tyrosine will eventually become dopamine, which will eventually become norepinephrine and epinephrine, also known as adrenaline. We've already talked about these. So, one of these pathways is associated with more of a relaxed, sleepy state. The other one is associated with a more, awake, alert state. Obviously, the adrenaline, the tyrosine pathway is a little more associated with the wakefulness state. And there are certain foods that are higher in tyrosine than others, and that can help you. If you consume more of these foods earlier in the day, it can tend to benefit you if you find yourself getting tired midday. So low carb, like ketogenic friendly foods tend to have more tyrosine content. So, red meat or nuts and white meat and higher carb foods tend to make you a little more sleepy. They have a little more like tryptophan content. Which again, sort of anecdotally makes sense, right? Like you've all heard the turkey on Thanksgiving tryptophan nap that we all have experienced. And it makes sense, again, from a biochemical standpoint. One other note on food, like food volume can also play a role. So, when you eat, the more food that you eat, obviously you're needing to digest the food. So blood rushes from other areas of your body to your gut to help process that food. When it does that, you also have vagal nerve stimulation. Vagus nerve is one of the primary, like maybe the most important nerve in your parasympathetic, like resting, digesting state, which can again lend to more kind of relaxing, tired, sleepy feelings. So given that logic, smaller meals would tend to make you less sleepy. Larger meals would tend to make you a little more sleepy. And again, we know this anecdotally, but now we kind of know there's an actual like biological like reason behind this. So, if you were counseling a patient, you could maybe say, hey, if you're getting tired in the daytime and taking extended naps that are interfering with your sleep in the evening, maybe try eating like more low carb foods earlier in the day and not eating as much of them, and then save your pasta and your white meat, those kind of things, your breads, for later in the day when you can eat a little more. So that's it. On the food and the exercise stuff, man, there was so much more I could have talked about, but just in the interest of time, I wanted to save some time at the end for discussion and questions and stuff like that. So again, I would recommend, strongly recommend the podcast and the lectures that Huberman provides. They're pretty gold if you are into, neurobiology and neurophysiology, and why and how we do the things we do and how our body functions. So in summary, optimal sleep is critical to maintaining both physical and mental health. We talked about sleep patterns, how they're governed by the two forces, right? So the adenosine and the circadian force. We talked about circadian force and rhythm and how it can be manipulated by external stimuli. And the objectives that we talked about at the beginning. So the first one, describing the importance of sleep as it applies to mental well-being. Talked about several times how the effect of suboptimal sleep on mental health, so like anxiety, depression. Talked about some dementia earlier in the presentation, the association between cortisol elevations later in the day and increased anxiety, depression in patients. Second one, identifying barriers to optimal sleep and strategies to overcome them. So barriers to optimal sleep, we talked about like viewing artificial light after 11, right? That's a barrier. Viewing light through filters or sunglasses, that's a barrier to setting that clock and achieving that optimal sleep. And then the last two, like I said, those could sort of be like lumped into one, applying your scientific principles of sleep and developing strategies to manage and intervene with patients who struggle with sleep. So several strategies. I mean, we talked about, making sure you get that 2 to 10 minute window of low angle sunlight in the morning and then again in the evening. Talked about timing, eating, and exercising to help regulate body temperature, which has a direct effect also on the circadian force. And we talked about different type of foods to eat, how much you can eat, what you can eat that can affect your body temperature and sleepiness. So yeah, hopefully you guys got a little bit of education today. Maybe you already knew most of this stuff. I didn't know a lot of it until, I didn't know like this in depth until, 3 or 4 months ago whenever I heard this lecture. So yeah, I just wanted to pass it on, and here are my references. And again, this is the Huberman Lab podcast that I kept referencing throughout the presentation. And this is my little one. I thought, this is my kind of go-to question slide because she looks like she's, questioning some stuff with those glasses on. But I thought I should, maybe for this one, I should have switched out with a picture of her sleeping. But yeah, a little too late for that. And there's your evaluation link. I'll leave that up for a second. Is there anything? Looks like there's a chat. Let me go to that really quick. Oh, Megan, yes, you love the Huberman. Yeah, it's great.
I have a question, Dr. Tiger. I'm curious if you're aware of any influence sex hormones, estrogen and testosterone can have on sleep, because we do see differences in sleep in men and women, and changes in sleep when women go into menopause. I'm just curious if you're aware of anything.
No, that's an awesome question. And yeah, I am aware that there are differences, but I have not, researched that particular topic enough to speak to it. But no, that's a good question. I'll make a note to try to find out a little more about it, because I'm sure you're not the only one that would have that question in the future. Anybody else? Looks like there's also a link here for your survey. Yeah, so if anyone else has any questions, we have like, I guess, 8 minutes left, or if you guys just want to take a restroom break before your next meetings or whatever you guys have.
So adenosine, I think you might have mentioned this, is a is it a nucleotide? And is there a way that we supplement with adenosine to help boost that effect of it?
Yeah, I didn't mention it, but I know just because in the past I've kind of looked into it. You can supplement with adenosine. However, it's kind of difficult whenever you start trying to. sort of like a nutrition nerd and supplementation nerd. Depending on who you talk to, the research is kind of shoddy on various like companies that make these supplements. So, you know, when I was researching this, for instance, there was a book that a guy named Matt Walker, he's a PhD, I think at Cal Berkeley, wrote a book about sleep. It's called Why We Sleep. And he referenced about melatonin, for instance, as a supplement. They took various companies' supplements of melatonin and tested them for like the amount of melatonin that was in them. And there was a huge variance of how much melatonin was in each capsule from the same bottle that would advertise like 3 grams or 3 milligrams or 5 milligrams, but would have drastic variances of like, you know, 50% less to 500 or 1,000% more per capsule. So with adenosine, I feel like that's something that would be similar. That's why, you know, I would probably, I mean, obviously you could self-experiment, which I've done in the past, not with adenosine, but just with other supplements, just to see if it does have an effect. But yeah, I would just kind of be careful with any kind of supplementation, honestly, any kind of like over-the-counter supplementation. Did that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Cool.
Thanks, Dr. Tiger.
Yeah, absolutely.
That was a great presentation. If anybody has any questions regarding the presentation or wants a PDF of the PowerPoint or has questions about CEs, please feel free to reach out to me directly. And I can also touch base with Dr. Tiger. And thanks everyone for joining us today, and Dr. Shed. We'll see you guys next time.
Thanks, everybody.